They destroyed a human colony. Now 3,000 warships are coming for them. The first thing I heard was the sound of metal groaning above my head. Not an explosion, not an alarm, just that low, long moan that a building makes when something very heavy lands on top of it, and the structure underneath has decided it is not going to hold much longer. I was in the relay station basement, sublevel 3, which sat about 40 meters below the surface of New Carthage. I had gone down there 20 minutes earlier to run a routine diagnostic on the emergency broadcast array. That diagnostic saved my life, though I did not know it yet. My name is Ilara Voss. I was a commander in the United Earth Defense Force, assigned to New Carthage as a military liaison. My job was mostly paperwork, treaties, trade agreements, the occasional inspection of the colony's small orbital defense battery. Nothing that ever made my hands shake. They were shaking now. The groan above me became a crack, and then a sound I do not have a good word for, something between a roar and a scream, came from every direction at once. The lights went out. The emergency strips along the floor lit up in dull orange. Dust fell from the ceiling in steady curtains, and I dropped beneath the main console and pulled my knees to my chest because there was nothing else to do. The shaking lasted for what felt like several minutes. Then it stopped. Then it started again. I pulled myself up to the console and brought the array's passive sensors online. They were old sensors, low power, designed only to confirm that a broadcast signal was going out, but they could pick up electromagnetic readings from orbit, and what they showed me made me sit very still for a long moment. 14 ships. No, more. The system was counting and recounting because the number kept changing. 19, 23. They were in low orbit, clustered above the colony's central districts, and they were firing. Not targeting the defense battery, not targeting military installations. They were firing in a wide, overlapping grid pattern that covered the residential areas, the market sectors, the schools, the hospitals. Everything. I opened a channel to the surface command post. Static. I tried the governor's emergency line. Static. I tried the colony's general frequency, the one every civilian terminal in New Carthage could access, the one that was supposed to broadcast evacuation orders in any emergency. I heard voices for about 4 seconds. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting coordinates, trying to organize people toward the underground shelters. Then the frequency collapsed into a long, steady hiss that told me the broadcast tower was gone. I sat in that basement for 6 hours. I know it was 6 hours because the array's internal clock kept running even when everything else failed. I sat there and I listened to my passive sensors update every 30 seconds. And I watched the electromagnetic readings from orbit stay strong and steady and relentless. And I understood that what was happening above my head was not a battle. There was no response from the surface. No counterfire. No ships rising from the colony's small defense platform to engage the attackers. There was only the one-sided, systematic output of weapons being fired by ships that had nothing shooting back at them. At some point during the 3rd hour, I stopped hoping that the silence meant people were hiding. I started understanding what the silence actually meant. At the 4-hour mark, I did something useful. I stopped sitting on the floor and I got up and I went to work. The array was still functional. Its power cell was independent of the colony grid, rated to last 72 hours. I set every sensor it had to record everything it could detect, and I opened the array's data core and began dictating. I gave my name, rank, and assignment. I gave the date and time. I gave the coordinates of New Carthage. I described what the sensors were showing me. I described the attack pattern, the ship signatures, the frequency of weapons fire. As I talked, the sensors were pulling apart the electromagnetic signatures of those ships in orbit, the specific harmonic patterns that every drive system and weapon array produces, patterns as unique as a fingerprint. I did not know the name of the species attacking us. I had never seen ships with those signatures before. But the data core was recording every detail, and wherever it ended up, someone would be able to use that information to identify them with certainty. I talked for 2 hours. Then I waited. The attacks from orbit stopped after 6 hours and 14 minutes. I know the exact time because I watched the sensor readings flatten out. The ships did not leave immediately. They stayed in orbit for another 3 hours, which I later understood was a sweep, confirming that nothing significant remained. Then their signatures faded as they moved away from the planet, accelerating toward a jump point. I waited another 12 hours before I went up. I want to be honest about what I found. I am going to be honest about it because a commander's job is to observe and report, and I made a decision in that basement that I was going to do my job with complete accuracy no matter what it cost me. The colony of New Carthage had held 2,341,612 people, families, workers, children who had been born on that world and had never seen Earth, old people who had come out here for the quiet and the wide skies and the slow pace of a young colony that was just learning to be itself. When I came up from sublevel 3 and walked out into the open air, I was the only living person on New Carthage. The sky was orange, not the orange of a sunset, the orange of particulate matter, of ash, of things that were no longer the shape they used to be. The main districts were gone, not damaged, not collapsed, gone, in the way that ground looks after something very hot has been applied to it for a very long time. I walked for 2 hours and I did not see another person. I saw the things that remain after people are no longer there, the metal frames of structures, the edges of roads, the occasional object that had somehow survived because it was in the shadow of something else. A ceramic mug, a child's boot, one half of a pair of reading glasses sitting in the middle of what used to be a street. I went back underground. I spent the next 3 weeks in that basement. The array's power cell held. I rationed the emergency food supply that was stored in sublevel 2. I kept talking into the data core. I recorded everything I observed during my surface walks, which I limited to 2 hours every other day to conserve my energy. I documented the sites I visited, the coordinates, the observable evidence of what had happened and when. I also sent a signal. The array was not designed to reach Earth directly. It was a relay station, meant to bounce signals to a network of deep space buoys that fed into the interstellar communications grid. I did not know if the buoys were still functional. I did not know if anyone was receiving. I sent the signal anyway, on every frequency the array could generate, with the data core's contents attached and flagged as a priority emergency transmission. I sent it every 8 hours for 3 weeks. On the 22nd day, a ship appeared in orbit. I tracked it on the sensors and I felt my heart rate increase because I could not tell yet whether it was another enemy vessel or something else. Then the ship broadcast on a standard United Earth frequency, and a voice came through the array's speaker that I did not recognize but that I will never forget. New Carthage Station. This is the patrol vessel UES Galloway. We have your signal. We are entering atmosphere. Please confirm your position. I gave them my coordinates. I held myself together very well until I saw the shuttle come down through the orange sky and land on the cleared ground 50 meters from the station entrance. Then a woman came down the ramp, a young officer with tired eyes and a look on her face that told me she had seen the surface and was still trying to process it. And she stopped when she saw me and she said, "Commander Voss?" I said yes. She said, "You are the only survivor we have found." I said I knew. She started to say something else, something that had the shape of comfort in it, and I stopped her. Not unkindly. I just needed her to hear the next thing clearly, so I said it plainly and without decoration. I need you to take the data core from sublevel 3 and transmit its entire contents to the United Earth Senate. Every frame, every reading, every second of documentation. Do not summarize it. Do not filter it. Send it exactly as it is. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, Commander." We left New Carthage 2 hours later. I sat in the back of the shuttle and watched the orange sky through the small window as we lifted away from the surface, and I thought about 2,341,612 people who did not get to leave. I did not look away until the sky turned black and the stars came out. That data core reached the Senate in 11 days. I know what happened when they watched it, because I was there. I sat in a chair at the front of the chamber, And I watched the senators of Earth watch what I had recorded. And I watched their faces. And I will say only this. There was not a single person in that room who looked the same when the recording ended, as they had looked when it began. The vote that followed took 11 minutes. It was unanimous. That had not happened in 400 years. What came next is the part that the rest of the galaxy was not ready for. What came next is the part that changed everything. The Galloway's captain, a quiet man named Owen Birch, told me on the journey back to Earth that the ship's crew had been picking up strange signals from deep space in the weeks before they found me. Unknown drive signatures, unusual movement patterns near the outer edge of human-explored territory. He had filed a report. It had gone up the chain. No one had responded yet. He was not angry about the lack of response. He said it with the flat tone of someone who had long ago accepted the pace of bureaucracy. But sitting in that shuttle bay, listening to him talk, I understood something that settled into my chest like cold water. They had been watching us. Whatever species had sent those ships to New Carthage, they had been watching us long enough to know that a colony on the outer edge was a soft target. They had planned this. They had chosen this. That meant it was not the last time they intended to do it. Owen Birch was still talking when I stood up, walked to the communication terminal at the back of the bay, and began composing a report of my own. Not for the Senate, for Admiral Cornelius Hayes, the commander of Earth's outer defense forces, a man I had met exactly once but whose reputation for reading a situation quickly was something everyone in the defense force knew about. I told him what I thought. Not what I knew, what I thought. I laid it out in 4 paragraphs and I sent it without asking anyone's permission. Hayes responded in 6 hours. He agreed with me. I arrived on Earth to find that the Senate's 11-minute vote had already set things in motion that I had not fully imagined were possible at that speed. The Cascade Protocol, a contingency plan that existed on paper and in military computers but had never been activated, was running. Every United Earth shipyard had received orders simultaneously. Civilian manufacturing contracts were being converted. The orbital platforms above Mars were already beginning the process of reconfiguration, their docking arms rotating toward the heavier military frames that had been sitting in cold storage for years. I stood on the Senate floor and I gave my testimony. I spoke for 4 days. Senators asked me questions, and I answered them with the same precision I had used in that basement, without drama, without performance, simply with detail. When I described the 6 hours and 14 minutes of constant bombardment, I heard the chamber go very quiet. When I read out the population figure, I did not hear anything at all. What I did not know, while I was testifying, was that the alien species had a name. The Galactic Conclave, a diplomatic body that humanity had been a provisional member of for 30 years, sent an emergency envoy to Earth within 48 hours of the Senate vote becoming public record. The envoy was a Grathani named Sulis, a tall, gray-skinned diplomat with large, dark eyes and a way of moving that always seemed slightly too careful, as if she was very aware of how breakable things were. Sulis told us their name, the Vorath, a militarized civilization that had been expanding through the outer quadrant for 2 centuries, absorbing or eliminating smaller species as they moved. The Conclave had been monitoring them for decades. They had never struck a human world before. Most analysts, Sulis told me quietly, had believed the Vorath viewed humanity as too distant and too new to be worth the effort. I asked her what the analysts thought now. She did not answer that question. Instead, she asked me one. How many ships will you send? I told her. She did not speak again for a long time. She stood very still, and her large dark eyes went through several expressions that I could not fully read. And then she said, very quietly, I see. I do not think she did. Not fully. Not yet. Hayes briefed me 3 days later on the full scope of what the Cascade Protocol meant. I had known the outline. I had not known the numbers. Earth's standard active fleet sat at roughly 9,000 warships of various classes. That was the number the Vorath had apparently found when they studied us. It was the number their strategists had used when calculating acceptable risk. 9,000 warships spread across a vast volume of space, committed to patrol routes and defensive positions, was not a force that could respond to a coordinated strike before it was finished. But Earth's military infrastructure had been built with a specific lesson in mind, a lesson learned 200 years ago when an early exploratory vessel had encountered a hostile civilization and barely escaped. After that encounter, Earth had made a decision that its politicians argued about for decades, but that its engineers and military planners carried out anyway. They built for surge, the shipyards, the manufacturing platforms, the raw material processing stations in the asteroid belt. All of it was designed not just for current needs but for rapid expansion, the ability to multiply force quickly if the situation ever demanded it. The situation demanded it. Hayes walked me through the projections. Within 6 months, the active fleet would cross 50,000 ships. Within a year, it would reach 180,000. The final projection, assuming all platforms reached full capacity, placed the number at somewhere between 280,000 and 320,000, depending on material supply chains. I sat with that number for a moment. Then I said, 300,000. Hayes looked at me. Round up, I said. Every ship we can get. I want the number to mean something when they see it. Hayes said nothing for a few seconds. Then he nodded. I was given a formal role in the operation, not as a combat commander, but as the senior legal and intelligence authority for what was being called the Retribution Armada. My task was to manage the evidence, the documentation, and the framework for what happened after the military objectives were achieved. Because there were going to be objectives beyond simply arriving. I had been very clear about that in my report to Hayes, and Hayes had been very clear about it with the Senate. We were not going to do what the Vorath had done to New Carthage. That was the line. That was the thing we held on to through every planning session and every operational meeting. We were not going to arrive and begin firing at civilian targets. We were not going to obliterate a civilization because a civilization had tried to obliterate ours. We were going there with 300,000 warships, and we were going to find the people who gave the order, and we were going to bring them back, and we were going to stand them in front of a court. That was the plan. There was a man in those planning sessions who disagreed. His name was Admiral Gareth Stowe, a large, broad-shouldered man with short gray hair and 28 years of combat experience, and he disagreed loudly and consistently and with a level of tactical logic that I could not always argue against on strategic grounds. Stowe believed that what had happened to New Carthage was going to happen again, to another colony, to another 2 million people, and that the only way to prevent it was to remove the Vorath's capacity to project force permanently. Not just to take their leaders, to take their fleet, their shipyards, every weapon system they had, leave them unable to threaten anyone for a generation. I understood his argument. Part of me agreed with it. But there is a difference between rendering something unable to attack you and rendering it unable to exist. I had spent 3 weeks alone in a basement on a dead world, and I knew something about what it meant to be the only one left, and I did not want to be the person who made 2 million people on a Vorath world feel what I had felt. Stowe and I argued about this for weeks. We were civil about it, mostly. What settled it, in the end, was not a debate. It was a man named Cheth. Cheth was a Vorath navigator who had been captured when his scout vessel responded to a signal from Colony Viridian and found something very different from what it expected. The colony had been evacuated. Every civilian gone, moved in 72 hours through a logistics operation that was quiet and efficient and invisible because we had gotten very good at moving people quickly, another lesson from 200 years ago. When Cheth's scout vessel dropped out of jump above Viridian, expecting a soft target, it found an empty world and 340 human warships waiting in silent formation. Cheth surrendered without firing a shot. He was brought to the Unbroken, the flagship of the Retribution Armada, which had become my home and my office and the place where I spent most of my hours reading intelligence reports and trying to understand the civilization we were about to confront. Cheth was brought to me in a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a translation system that one of our xenolinguistics officers had assembled from Vorath communications intercepts. He sat across from me, and he looked at me with eyes that were pale amber and slightly too wide, and he said, through the translator, that he wanted to tell me something. I said I was listening. He told me that the attack on New Carthage had not been ordered by the Vorath government. It had been ordered by a single admiral, a man named Dreth, who commanded a faction within the Vorath military that believed expanding borders required decisive demonstrations of power against new neighbors. Dreth had acted without the government's approval. He had done it and then presented it as a success, a demonstration of Vorath's strength, before the government could stop him. But the government had not condemned it publicly. They had been afraid to. Dreth had allies, influence, a portion of the military that answered to him personally. So they had stayed silent, and their silence had looked like approval, and that silence was now bringing 300,000 human warships toward their home system. Cheth said there was already a civil conflict beginning inside Vorath space. Factions that opposed Dreth were fighting for control. The government was fracturing. Some elements wanted to prepare for the human fleet. Others wanted to negotiate. Others wanted to hand Dreth over immediately and hope that was enough. I listened to all of it. Then I went back to my cabin, and I did not sleep for 3 days. The jump to Vorath space took 47 days at the Armada's sustained travel speed. I counted every one of them. Those 47 days were not quiet. The Armada was not simply a fleet moving through space. It was a civilization in motion. 300,000 ships from every corner of human-explored territory, crewed by people who had volunteered by the tens of millions within the first 2 weeks of the call going out. Every ship had a crew. Every crew had come from somewhere. They had come from colonies and stations and orbital platforms and the surface of Earth itself. And they had come because the same vote that had been unanimous in the Senate had also been unanimous in the hearts of almost every person who had heard what happened to New Carthage. I walked the corridors of the Unbroken every day. I talked to the crew, not as a commander conducting inspections, but as a person who needed to understand what was around her. A young sensor operator named Caleb Marsh told me he had a cousin on New Carthage. He had been waiting for 3 weeks to hear something before the news confirmed there was no one to hear from. He was 22 years old, and he had very steady hands, and he never raised his voice, and he sat at his station every shift, with a focus that I found both admirable and slightly difficult to look at directly. A navigation officer named Fiona Cole had served on a supply run to New Carthage 8 months before the attack. She told me about the market she had visited, the food she had eaten, a street performer who had been doing something clever with light and mirrors that she had stood watching for 40 minutes because she could not figure out how the trick worked. She said it in a flat voice, not because she was unaffected, but because she had been living with it for a long time, and had gotten to the other side of the initial shock and arrived at the quieter place beyond it. I understood that place very well. The Unbroken's medical officer was a man named Gerald Okafor, and Gerald had a habit of finding me in the observation corridor at night when neither of us could sleep, and we would stand together and look at the stars passing at jump velocity, which created a streaked, liquid quality to the view. And Gerald would talk about whatever was in his head. He talked about his home in Lagos. He talked about his daughter who wanted to study planetary science and had applied to a program at the New Carthage Institute before the attack. He talked about the nature of grief, which was his professional area of expertise, and he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said that grief is not only for the people you knew, it is also for the people you will now never know, for the person who would have discovered something, or written something, or built something, or simply lived a quiet, ordinary life that touched other quiet, ordinary lives in ways you could not trace or measure. Those possibilities were gone too. That was part of what was lost. I thought about the child's boot I had found in the street. I did not talk about that, but I thought about it. It was during the 3rd week of transit that Hayes asked me to come to the command level for a private briefing, and I arrived to find not just Hayes but also Admiral Stowe and 3 members of the Strategic Planning Council, and I understood before anyone spoke that something had changed. It had. The Intelligence Division had intercepted a burst transmission from inside Vorath space that had been decoded by our xenolinguistics team. It confirmed most of what Cheth had told me. There was active internal conflict in Vorath space. Dreth's faction was not in full control. There was a significant element of the Vorath government that was, according to The Intercept, desperately trying to find a way to respond to the approaching fleet that did not end in complete catastrophe. They were afraid, genuinely, deeply afraid, in a way that The Intercepts made plain even through the filter of translation. They had not believed 300,000 was the real number. They had believed it was propaganda, exaggeration, a psychological operation designed to make them capitulate without a fight. Their own scouts had gone out and counted. The number was real. Stowe read The Intercept, and then he looked at me across the table and he said, "They want to negotiate." I said, "Good." He said, "Negotiating from this position means we can get everything we asked for." I said, "I know." He said, "So why does it look like you are already thinking about what happens after?" Because I was. That was the truth. I had been thinking about what happened after, since the first week of transit. Because the military problem, as enormous and complex as it was going to be temporary. The fleet would arrive. Something would occur. The fleet would eventually go home. And then there would be a before and an after. A shape to how humanity existed in this part of the galaxy that would be defined by what we did with 300,000 warships when we finally arrived. That was the thing I was carrying through those 47 days. Not the mission, the meaning of the mission. I asked Hayes to schedule a full command meeting, and to include Sulis, who had remained aboard the Unbroken, as the Galactic Conclave's observer throughout the transit. Hayes gave me a look that asked a question without words, and I answered it the same way, and he said he would set the meeting for the following morning. That night, I stood at the observation window for 3 hours. The stars ahead of us were the stars of Vorath space, still distant, still just patterns of light that looked like all the other stars in all the other directions. But they were the ones we were heading toward, and the fleet behind me and around me and in every direction I could look was the most concentrated human presence ever assembled in one place in the history of our species. I thought about what Cheth had said. I thought about what Gerald had said about the people you would never know. I thought about Admiral Dreth, whom I had never seen and only knew as a name attached to a set of decisions. And I thought about what it meant to make someone answer for something. Not to remove them. Not to erase them the way New Carthage had been erased. To stand them in front of the people they had harmed, and the people who represented the people they had harmed, and make them account for what they had done. Make it part of the record. Make it real and permanent and known. That was what I wanted. I had known it since the basement. I had just taken 47 days to fully understand why. In the morning, I went to the meeting, and I talked for 2 hours, and when I was finished, even Stowe was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All right, we do it your way, but if it goes wrong, the fallback is mine." I said that was fair. Hayes called the full command staff together an hour later and issued the updated operational orders. The Armada would proceed to the Vorath home system. It would position around every major Vorath system simultaneously, using coordinated jump timing that our navigators had been calculating for weeks. It would not fire first. It would not target civilian locations under any circumstances. It would open communications with the Vorath government and with the faction opposing Dreth. And it would ask for one thing: hand over Admiral Dreth, in person, to us. Whatever happened after that would be determined by what the Vorath did next. The jump coordinator aboard the Unbroken, a young woman named Petra Walsh, came to me with the final timing calculations and laid them on the table in front of me. She had been working on this for 6 weeks, coordinating with jump officers across the entire Armada to synchronize the exit points down to the millisecond. I looked at the numbers. I looked at the projected positions. 300,000 ships, appearing at once across every system the Vorath held. A presence so total and so simultaneous that there would be no way to interpret it as anything other than what it was. I asked Petra how confident she was in the timing. She said 97.4% accuracy across all ships. I said that was good enough. She left. I sat at the table alone for a few minutes. The jump countdown was 48 hours away. I took out the small recording device I had been carrying since New Carthage. The personal one I had used in the basement when the data core's official recording was running, and I needed somewhere to put the things I could not say in an official record. I turned it on. I said, "We are 48 hours out. The Armada is ready. 300,000 ships, the most any human has ever seen in one place. I do not feel powerful. I feel responsible. There is a difference, and I think it matters." I turned it off. I went to sleep for the first time in 3 days. Nothing about those final 48 hours felt the way I thought they would. I had imagined that the approach to the Vorath home system would feel like a building pressure, like the air before a storm that you can feel on your skin long before the rain arrives. Instead, the Armada moved with the same steady, organized precision it had maintained throughout the transit. Crew rotations on schedule, systems checks completed on time, the enormous and quiet machinery of 300,000 ships, continuing to function exactly as it had been functioning for weeks. The thing that changed was the silence in the command center. Not an absence of sound. People were still talking, still working, still running the practical operations of a fleet in transit. But there was a quality to the quiet underneath it, a shared awareness settling over everyone who understood what was about to happen. I felt it too. I felt it in my shoulders, in the way my breathing slowed without my choosing it. Caleb Marsh, at his sensor station, sat with a stillness that had nothing to do with inattention. Fiona Cole plotted the final course adjustments with movements so precise they looked almost mechanical. 14 hours out, the Vorath long-range sensors would have detected our approach. I know this because 12 hours out, the first signal arrived. It came on a frequency that our communications team had flagged as a Vorath diplomatic channel. The message was short. It came from an identification code that, when run through our intelligence database, resolved to an office within the Vorath government, not Dreth's faction, the other one, the element that had been trying to manage the crisis from inside. The translation read, "We are aware of your approach. We are seeking resolution. Please respond." I drafted the response myself. It took me 11 minutes. I wrote, "We are aware of your awareness. Seeking resolution is the correct instinct. We will speak when we arrive. Prepare your government to receive us. We come for one specific purpose. Be ready to hear it." I sent it and did not wait for a response. 8 hours out, Stowe came to the command center and stood beside me at the main display, where the tactical map showed the Armada's position relative to the Vorath home system. He studied it for a while without speaking. Then he said, "The fleet defending their home system has approximately 4,200 active warships. Their outer colonies have another 3,000 combined." I said I knew. He said, "Against 300,000, those numbers are not a defensive force. They are a formality." I said, "That is exactly what I want them to understand when we arrive." He nodded slowly. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "You know, when this started, I thought you were going to get in the way of the mission." I looked at him. He said, "I was wrong. The mission is what you say it is. The fleet is the argument. What you do with the argument is the mission." He walked back to his position. I watched him go. The final jump countdown ran in the lower corner of the command center's main display. Every ship in the Armada, 300,000 of them across multiple coordinated formations, was tracking the same countdown. Petra Walsh and her team had spent 6 weeks on those timing calculations. In 4 hours and 22 minutes, every ship would enter jump simultaneously. The transit would take 3 seconds, and then they would emerge. Not at one point. Not in one system. Everywhere. I had asked for that specifically. I had sat with Hayes and the strategic planners, and I had said that the first thing the Vorath needed to understand was that there was no part of the space they controlled where they could feel safe and unobserved, and free to make decisions in private. Not because we intended to harm them everywhere, but because they needed to know that we had the reach and the coordination to be everywhere, and that we had chosen to use that reach for a specific and limited purpose. An hour before the jump, the Galactic Conclave channel activated, and Sulis came to the command center and stood beside me. She had spent the 47 days of transit moving between quiet observation and careful questions, taking in everything, saying little. She had spoken at the full command meeting when asked for the conclave's position, and the conclave's position had been, in summary, that this was unprecedented, and they were watching closely, and they hoped it concluded in a way that did not reshape the power structure of the quadrant, in a manner they would be managing for the next century. She said now, quietly, "Are you prepared?" I said, "I have been prepared since day 23 in the basement." She made a small sound that might have been agreement. Then she said, "The conclave has received 47 formal inquiries from member species in the past 6 weeks. Every one of them asking the same question. What will the humans do?" I said, "What did you tell them?" She said, "That I did not know. That humans were proving difficult to predict." I almost smiled. I said, "Good." The countdown reached 0. The Armada jumped. 3 seconds of non-space, where the universe does not quite apply to you in the usual ways, where you exist in the gap between one point and another, and the only thing that feels real is the hum of the ship around you. Then the stars came back. And on every sensor, every display, every readout in the command center of the Unbroken, the picture of the Vorath home system assembled itself in real time. Their planet, their orbital stations, their shipyards, and their defense fleet. 4,200 warships suddenly surrounded on every side by something they had no frame of reference for. The command center was completely silent. Fiona Cole looked at her navigation display and then looked up at the main screen and said, quietly, "All 300,000 ships confirm arrival. Jump coordination successful." Petra Walsh, at her station across the room, let out a breath that was almost inaudible. I looked at the sensor display. The Vorath defense fleet had stopped moving. Every one of their 4,200 ships had frozen in place. Not because they had been ordered to, because the people on those ships were looking at their own sensors and processing what they saw, and what they saw had no tactical response in any manual they had ever read. The signal from the Vorath diplomatic channel came 30 seconds after our arrival. It was not a threat. It was not a challenge. It was 3 words in Vorath that translated, once our system had processed them, to something like, "We are listening." I sat down in the command chair. I had not sat in it during the entire transit. I had always stood. But now I sat, because what came next was not a battle. It was a conversation, and conversations did not require you to be on your feet. I opened the fleet-wide channel first. Every ship in the Armada could hear what I said next. I said, "Hold position. No weapons active. No movement without my order. We wait." Then I opened the Vorath diplomatic channel. I spoke slowly and clearly, so that the translation system would have no difficulty. I said, "My name is Commander Elara Voss, of the United Earth Defense Force. I am the senior authority of the Retribution Armada. I was the only survivor of the colony of New Carthage. 2,341,612 people lived on that world. They did not survive. We have come because of them. We have come for one specific thing. We want Admiral Dreth, alive, in our custody. That is the purpose of our arrival. I am prepared to hear your response." Then I closed the channel and waited. The next 40 hours were the longest of my life. The Vorath did not respond immediately. That was expected. There was obviously a significant amount of argument happening on their end, factions pushing in different directions, the government trying to maintain enough control to make a coherent decision, while simultaneously managing what I imagined was an enormous amount of fear throughout their population. I did not rush them. The Armada stayed in position. No ship moved without authorization. No weapon was charged. Caleb Marsh monitored the Vorath defense fleet continuously and reported every 30 minutes that their ships had not moved either. The standoff had a strange, almost formal quality. 2 forces, one incomparably larger than the other, holding still and watching each other across a distance that felt both enormous and very small. On the second day, a different signal came through, not from the diplomatic channel, from a private military frequency that our signals team spent 3 hours decoding before they brought it to me. It was from a Vorath officer who identified himself as General Vale. and he said that he commanded the faction within the Vorath military that had opposed Dreth's actions from the beginning. He said that his forces and Dreth's forces had been in direct conflict since the New Carthage attack. He said that Dreth was currently aboard a command cruiser designated by a serial number that translated into human registry as a vessel type we would call a heavy carrier. He gave us the vessel's location. It was in orbit above the third moon of the Vorath homeworld. He said, "We can take him, or you can, but he needs to be taken, and it needs to be visible, and it needs to be understood by everyone watching as a consequence of what he did." I read that message 4 times. Then I called Hayes and Stowe and Sulis to the command room, and I read it aloud to them. Stowe said, "It could be a trap." I said, "Everything could be a trap. That does not change the calculation." Hayes said, "If it is not a trap, and we refuse the offer, we are telling the faction that opposed Dreth that their gesture means nothing to us." I said, "Exactly." Sulis said nothing. She was watching me with those large dark eyes, and I had the impression that she was learning something she had not known before about the way humans made decisions. I composed a response to General Vale. I told him that we appreciated the information. I told him that we would proceed to the indicated position with a small escort of 20 ships, and that whatever vessel Dreth was aboard would be hailed and asked to stand down, and that if it did not stand down, the Armada's full attention would shift to that ship within 30 seconds. I also told him that no other Vorath ship would be harmed in this process. If Dreth's vessel chose not to surrender, we would deal with Dreth's vessel. Everything else would remain untouched. Vale responded in 7 minutes. He said, "Understood." I took the Unbroken and 19 escort ships toward the third moon. The carrier was exactly where Vale had said it would be. It was a large vessel, scarred from what looked like recent combat, which told me it had been in Vale's civil conflict. It was broadcasting on a closed military channel, and when our signals team intercepted the channel, we could hear voices on it, fast and urgent. People who had just watched 20 human ships separate from the larger armada and move toward them, and were trying to decide what that meant. I opened a channel to the carrier. I said, "This is Commander Voss of the Retribution Armada. You are carrying Admiral Dreth. I am asking you to stand down and prepare to transfer your admiral to our custody. You have 10 minutes to respond." I watched the carrier on the tactical display. It did not move for 8 of those 10 minutes. Then, at the 9-minute mark, something happened that I had not planned for. The carrier began moving. Not toward us, toward the nearest jump point. They were going to run. I said, "All 300,000 ships, reorient toward that carrier." I did not need all 300,000. I just needed the Vorath to understand what it meant for all 300,000 to notice you. The carrier's engines cut off at the 10-second mark after my order. It sat in space, not jumping, not advancing, not retreating. Then the carrier broadcast on an open frequency, and the voice on the broadcast was older and harder than the others, and even through the translation system, I could hear something in it that I recognized from my 3 weeks in the basement. I recognized it because I had felt it myself. Uncertainty. The voice said, in translation, "This is Admiral Dreth. What is your guarantee of treatment?" I said, "Your life. A trial before a joint tribunal of species. The right to speak in your own defense. A verdict based on evidence. That is what I offer." It is more than 2,341,612 people received. The channel was quiet for 40 seconds. Then Dreth said, "I will come." The shuttle carrying Admiral Dreth docked with the Unbroken 3 hours later. I was there to meet it. I stood in the docking bay with Hayes and 2 security officers and Sulis, and I watched the shuttle ramp come down, and I watched a man walk down it who looked older than I had imagined. He was tall but carried himself with the particular heaviness of someone who had not slept in a long time. His eyes were the pale amber color of all Voraths, but they moved slowly, taking in the bay, the humans standing in it, the size of the Unbroken around him. He stopped at the bottom of the ramp. He looked at me. I looked at him. I said, "Admiral Dreth, You are in human custody. You will be transported to a neutral facility for trial. You will be treated with respect throughout this process." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, through his translator, "You came all this way." I said yes. He said, "For a trial." I said, "For accountability. The trial is the method." He looked around the docking bay again, as if trying to understand the scale of what he had seen outside the viewport of his shuttle. Then he looked back at me and he said something that the translation system rendered as, "I did not think you would come this way. I thought you would come the other way." I said, "We considered it." He said, "Why did you not?" I said, "Because we know what it looks like when someone does. We were not willing to look like that." He was taken to a secure holding area. Sulis, standing beside me as we watched him go, said quietly, "That was not the answer he expected." I said, "I know." She said, "It was not the answer any of us expected." I said, "Good." The Armada began the process of standing down from full alert. Not withdrawing, not yet, but reducing the active readiness level that had been maintained throughout the standoff. Around the Vorath home system and its colonies, the 300,000 ships continued to hold their positions, but the particular quality of held breath that a fleet carries when weapons are one decision away from being used began to ease. Hayes called a command meeting that evening and laid out the next phase. The Vorath government, General Vale's faction now effectively in operational control after Dreth's surrender, had agreed to begin negotiations with the Galactic Conclave. Sulis would lead the Conclave side of those talks. Humanity would participate as the primary party of harm, which gave us a formal standing in determining outcomes. Stowe asked what outcomes we were seeking beyond the trial. I had prepared for that question. I had been preparing for it since the transit. I said, 3 things. First, the trial proceeds to completion under joint oversight. Second, every Vorath military vessel that participated in the New Carthage attack is documented, tracked, and permanently decommissioned. Third, a binding agreement under conclave law that prohibits orbital strikes against civilian populations, with enforcement mechanisms that have actual teeth. Stowe said, "That last one is going to take time." I said yes. It is going to take exactly as much time as it takes to do correctly. He looked at me. He said, "You plan to come home with a law." I said, "I plan to come home with more than we left with." The command meeting continued for another 2 hours, working through logistics and protocols and timelines. Around us, the Armada waited in the quiet of Vorath space, and I thought about how strange it was to be here, in this system, surrounded by these stars, and to be talking about agreements and tribunals and the precise language of international law. I thought about Caleb Marsh at his sensor station, steady-handed, saying nothing. I thought about Fiona Cole and the street performer with the mirror trick she had never figured out. I thought about Gerald Okafor talking about the people you would never know. I thought about a child's boot in the middle of a street. When the meeting ended, I went back to the observation window. Vorath space looked like any other space from this distance. Stars spread across black, the planets below us visible as curved shapes with atmosphere glowing faintly at their edges. Somewhere in the system, 2 million people were going about their lives not knowing yet what the next few months would mean for them. They had not chosen Dreth. Many of them had been as afraid of his faction as anyone in human space. They were going to face years of difficult change, a government restructuring, a military reformation, and the weight of what one man with too much authority had done in their name. That was its own kind of consequence, not the one I had chosen, the one that was already there, already following from the decisions already made. I stayed at the window until the ship's night cycle began, and the lights in the corridor dimmed around me. I thought about New Carthage. I thought about what it had looked like from orbit when we lifted away, the orange sky, the ash, the total absence of the living city that had been there before. And I thought about what it was going to look like in 10 years, when the revegetation project that the Senate had already approved would have begun to push green through the gray, and the memorial that the architects were already designing would stand in the center of what had been the main district, and people would come there from every human world to stand in front of it and read the names. All 2,341,612 of them. Every name. Every single one. The tribunal took 6 months to convene properly. 6 months of negotiations between humanity, the Vorath Conclave delegates, General Vale's transition government, and 11 other species who had formally requested observer status after the events in Vorath space became public record. 6 months of legal teams and diplomatic representatives arguing about jurisdiction, procedure, evidentiary standards, and the precise language of every clause in every agreement that was being assembled alongside the criminal proceedings. I was present for almost all of it. My role had shifted from military authority to primary witness and evidence custodian. The data core from New Carthage, the recordings I had made in the basement, the sensor logs from the array, all of it was submitted to the tribunal's evidence committee and catalogued under a system that took 3 weeks to agree on and another 2 months to implement. There were 47 lawyers involved in managing the evidence alone. I met with most of them at least once, and with some of them so many times that I could recognize their footsteps in the corridor outside my office. The tribunal was held aboard a purpose-built station in neutral space, between human and Vorath territory. The station had been constructed in 4 months, which was considered remarkable by every species that observed the process, since most of them expected construction on that scale to take years. The humans who built it did not find it remarkable. They found it necessary, and they treated necessity the way they treated most things, as a problem with a solution that was going to be found by the people assigned to find it. The station was called the Carthage Accord Station. The name had been proposed by Sulis, which I found meaningful. On the day the tribunal opened, I was the first witness called. I walked into the chamber, and I looked out at a room that held representatives from 17 species, judges from 5 neutral civilizations who had agreed to form the judicial panel, translators running feeds in 31 languages simultaneously, and at a separate table, flanked by the counsel he had been assigned, Admiral Dreth. He looked at me when I entered. I looked at him. I sat down. The senior judge, a Grathani named Elder Sale, whose voice was so low it seemed to come from somewhere beneath the floor, said, "Commander Voss, you will give your account from the beginning." I said, "Yes." I spoke for 4 days. On the first day, I described New Carthage before the attack, the colony, the people, the ordinary details of a world that had been building itself for 40 years, and had every reason to expect 40 more. I described my assignment, my role, the routine nature of the work I had been doing. I described going to Sub-Level 3 for a diagnostic. On the second day, I described the attack. I used the sensor data, which was displayed on screens throughout the chamber as I spoke. I gave timestamps. I gave coordinates. I gave the duration of each phase of the bombardment. I described what the sensors showed, and what I concluded from what the sensors showed. I described going to the surface. I am not going to describe what I said on the second day beyond that summary. The chamber's record holds all of it in precise detail, and it is publicly available, and if you choose to read it, you should do so with time set aside afterward. I will say that on the second day, no one in the chamber left. 17 species, judges and representatives and observers and legal teams, and the chamber was still and it stayed still. And the only sounds were my voice, and the translators, and the soft, continuous sound of the ventilation system moving air through a room full of beings who were breathing. On the third day, I described the 3 weeks in the basement, the work I had done, the recordings, the signal I had sent, the 22 days of waiting. On the fourth day, I described what had happened after, the Senate, the vote, the Armada, the transit, the arrival, the 40 hours of waiting in Vorath space, the moment when Dreth's carrier had tried to run, the moment when it stopped. And then I did one more thing. I had requested permission from the tribunal chair to play a recording at the end of my testimony. The chair had reviewed the recording and approved it. I pressed the control on the small device in front of me, and the recording began to play through the chamber's audio system. It was the broadcast from the relay buoy that had been left in orbit above Colony Viridian, the one that had been transmitted on a loop for 19 hours before the Vorath scout vessel intercepted it. The names: all 2,341,612 of them. I did not play all 19 hours. I played 45 minutes. Then I stopped it. The chamber was completely silent. Elder Sael said, "You may step down, Commander Voss." I stood. I looked out at the room one more time. Then I looked at Dreth. He had not moved in 45 minutes. He was sitting in his chair with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and his eyes pointed at a fixed spot somewhere beyond the far wall, and he stayed in that position as I walked out of the chamber. The prosecution presented its case over the following 4 weeks. The defense presented its case over 2 weeks after that. The judicial panel deliberated for 18 days. The verdict was delivered on a morning when the station's observation ports were angled toward a star cluster that looked like scattered light through dark water. I was in the chamber for the verdict. So was every representative, every observer, every person who could fit. The panel found Admiral Dreth guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was held 3 days later. I had submitted a formal recommendation on behalf of the Human Party. I had submitted it 8 weeks earlier, before the testimony even began, because I had known since the transit what I was going to recommend, and I had not wanted the emotion of the moment to change it. My recommendation was that Dreth be sentenced to imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life, in a facility maintained jointly by no fewer than 5 species, with no possibility of the kind of solitary isolation that could be turned into a mythology. He would be visible, accessible to researchers and legal scholars, a permanent and living part of the record of what had happened. Not a martyr, not a forgotten prisoner, a consequence that stayed in the room. The panel's sentence was close to what I recommended: life imprisonment in a joint facility. The facility would be administered under the same station authority that governed the Carthage Accord Station, which itself was becoming a permanent institution rather than a temporary venue. After the sentencing, I walked outside the main chamber to a smaller corridor with a viewport that looked into space, and I stood there alone for a while. Gerald Okafor found me there, as he had a way of doing throughout the mission. He stood beside me and looked at the stars, and did not say anything for several minutes. Then he said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I do not know yet." He said, "That is probably honest." I said, "I thought I would feel something clear, something I could name." He said, "It is rarely clear. Justice is not the same as resolution. It is not even close to the same thing." I said, "No." He said, "But it is something. It is real." I said, "Yes, it is real." We stood there a while longer. The Carthage Accord was signed 4 months after the verdict. The full name was the New Carthage Convention on Civilian Protection in Armed Conflict, and it ran to 240 pages. The enforcement provisions had been written primarily by a team of human legal scholars who had worked on them for 7 months, closing every gap and accounting for every edge case with the particular thoroughness that came from being the people who understood most specifically what happened when such provisions did not exist. 11 species signed on the first day. 4 more signed within the following month. The Vorath transition government signed as one of the original 11. General Vale was present at the signing, and he looked at the document for a long time before he put his mark on it, and I was close enough to see his face, and what was in it was not relief or satisfaction or pride. It was the expression of someone who understood the full weight of what they were putting their name to. I respected that. After the signing, Sulis came to me and said, "The Conclave has voted to make the New Carthage Convention a foundational document. It will have treaty-level status across all member species within 2 years." I said, "Good." She said, "You came here for one man, and you left with a law." I said, "We came for accountability. The law is what accountability looks like when you do it properly." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been an observer of many species for a long time. I have watched many conflicts reach their conclusions. I have watched them concluded with force, with negotiation, with attrition, with the simple passage of time, and the exhaustion of all parties. She paused. She said, "I have not often watched one concluded with a specific, deliberate insistence on a standard." I said, "We had a good reason to be deliberate." She said, "Yes, 2,341,612 reasons." I did not respond to that. There was nothing to add. The Armada began its journey home 6 weeks after the Accord signing. Not all at once. Ships peeled away in groups, assigned back to their patrol routes and stations and home ports as the operational requirements wound down. The Unbroken was one of the last to leave. Hayes wanted the flagship to remain until the final administrative handover of the Carthage Accord station to its permanent joint management body was complete. The handover happened on a morning that felt ordinary, in a way that extraordinary things rarely manage to feel at their conclusions. There was a ceremony. Speeches were given. Documents were signed. The station's command officially transferred to a joint council of 7 species. Then the ceremony ended and people went back to work, because that is what happens after ceremonies, and it is perhaps the most honest thing about them. On the day we left, I went to the docking bay where the shuttle was waiting to take the remaining delegation back to the Unbroken for the journey home. I was walking to it when I felt something pressed into my hand, and I looked down, and I looked up, and standing in the corridor was a Vorath child. She could not have been more than 8 years old by Vorath developmental standards. She was small, with the pale amber eyes and the careful, deliberate movements of her species, and she was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read. The way a child looks at something they understand is important, but do not yet have all the words for. She had pressed something into my palm. I looked at it. It was a seed, dark brown and slightly glossy, about the size of my thumbnail. I looked back at her. She said nothing. She just looked at me for another moment. Then she turned and walked away down the corridor, toward a woman I assumed was her parent who was standing a distance away and watching with that same careful expression. I held the seed in my hand all the way back to the Unbroken. I held it through the transit home, which took 47 days as it had going out, though the feeling of those days was entirely different from the transit to Vorath space. The ship was quieter in a way that had nothing to do with fewer sounds. Caleb Marsh still sat at his station. Fiona Cole still navigated. Gerald Okafor still found me at the observation window. But the particular weight we had all been carrying for months had changed. It was still there. It did not go away. But it had become something you could hold without it holding you. On the 30th day of transit, Fiona Cole told me she had been accepted to a graduate program in planetary science, the one her daughter had wanted to attend at the New Carthage Institute. She said she was not sure the institute was going to rebuild on New Carthage or relocate, but that she had been accepted regardless and was going to go. I told her that was excellent. She said, "My daughter would have been good at it. I think I will be all right at it." I said, "I think you will be better than all right." She went back to her console. I watched her for a moment. On the final day of transit, I went to the cargo bay, where I had stored the things I was bringing home. There were not many. The data core, now duplicated across 17 secure systems, across 3 different governmental archives. My personal recording device, the clothes I had packed for what was supposed to be a 3-month rotation and had stretched into nearly a year, and the seed, which I had wrapped carefully in a cloth and placed in a sealed container. I was going to New Carthage before I went anywhere else. I had arranged it with Hayes before we left Vorath space. 1 week on the surface. The revegetation project had already begun in the outlying districts, and the memorial architects had broken ground on the central site. I wanted to see it. I also wanted to plant something. When we arrived at New Carthage, the sky was no longer orange. It had taken many months, but the atmospheric processors the Senate had deployed in the first weeks after the attack had been working continuously, and the sky above what remained of the colony was now the particular shade of early blue that planetary atmospheres manage when they are beginning to recover. Not beautiful yet, not the clear, wide sky that the colony had earned over 40 years of careful terraforming, but not orange, blue, and getting clearer. I came down in a shuttle. I came down alone, which was what I wanted. The pilot waited at the landing site, and I walked out into the morning air of New Carthage, and I breathed it, and it tasted of soil and moisture, and something I could not name but that felt like the beginning of something. The revegetation crews had been working in sectors, moving outward from the edges of the worst affected areas. Where they had been working, there was green, small and low to the ground but present and real, grass and ground cover, and some early pioneer plants with small yellow flowers that grow in the ash of things that have burned. I walked for an hour. I walked through areas the crews had not reached yet, where the ground was still gray and bare, where you could still see the shapes of streets in the way the rubble arranged itself, where a ceramic mug, or a single wall, or the steel skeleton of a building stood in the quiet that had replaced the city. I stopped in what had been the central market district. I knew it from maps, from the satellite imagery and the data files I had studied on the transit home. I stood in the middle of a cleared space where vendors had sold food and handmade goods, and where people had met and talked and made the ordinary decisions of ordinary days. I took the seed out of its container. I did not know what it grew into. I had asked 3 botanists aboard the Unbroken if they could identify it from my description, and none of them could with certainty. One of them thought it might be something with broad leaves. Another thought it might flower in spring, under the right conditions. No one knew how tall it would grow or how long it would take. I did not mind not knowing. I knelt down and pressed it into the soil, into a spot in the middle of that cleared space. And I covered it over, and I stayed there for a moment with my hand flat on the ground. Then I stood up. The sky was blue above me. The air was cool. Somewhere behind me, the memorial architects were beginning another day of construction, and their tools made small, clear sounds that traveled a long way in the morning quiet. I thought about the child who had pressed the seed into my hand. She had not said a word. I did not know her name. I did not know what she had understood about why she was handing it to me, or what she thought would happen to it. But she had been on a station between human and Vorath space, which meant someone in her family had been part of the Vorath delegation, or the Vorath legal team, or one of the other administrative bodies that had kept people on the station for months. She had grown up watching that process. She had watched her own species go through the hardest kind of reckoning, the kind where you have to look at what was done in your name and decide what to do with the fact of it. And she had found me in a corridor and pressed a seed into my hand and walked away. I took that to mean something. I am not entirely sure what, but I took it to mean something. I walked back toward the shuttle. The ground under my feet was still gray in most places, still bearing the marks of what had happened here. But the green was at the edges of my vision, low and persistent, and the sky was blue, and the architect's tools rang quietly in the morning air, and somewhere in the soil behind me a seed was beginning whatever it was going to become. I got back to the shuttle. I told the pilot I was ready to go home. We lifted off, and I watched the ground fall away beneath us, and I watched the memorial site grow small, and I watched the beginning lines of green at the district edges, and I watched the whole spread of what had been a city and what was going to be, in time, something else, something built on what had come before, and incorporating it, and not pretending it had not happened. Then the sky turned blue around us, and then it turned the particular shade that sky turns when you are at the edge of it, and then it turned black, and the stars came out, and I was looking at them from the window the same way I had looked at them on the night we left this place, the first time, all those months ago. But this time I was not trying to hold myself together. This time I was just looking. The stars looked back, the way they always do, without comment, without judgment, without the particular burden of having opinions about what the beings moving between them choose to do with the time they have. I put my hand flat on the cold viewport glass. I said their names quietly, the first 100 that I had memorized in those long nights on the Unbroken, and I meant every one. Then I let the silence have them, and I went home.